When we crack the door open for something different, you will get people that will say, yeah, I've been ready. You'll get people that will say, I'm curious, but I didn't know what that looked like. And you will have donors that will say, yeah, I'm not interested in that. This is not the conversation I want to have with you. And all of those things are okay because it's what's true. It's what's happening between our organization and the donor. We have a decision to make about where we invest our time, our resources, our energy to make sure that whatever resources we're organizing actually get our communities what they need.
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Rachel D'Souza. Rachel, welcome to What the Fundraising.
I am so excited to be here, Mallory. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited for our conversation. Why don't we start with you just telling everyone a little bit about you and your work and what brings you to our conversation today?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think like any woman, I wear multiple hats. So I am the founder and principal of Gladiator Consulting, which is a nonprofit consulting firm located in St. Louis, Missouri. We really have the goal of reimagining what nonprofit work, what fundraising work looks like across the social sector in the United States. So we do a lot of resource organizing and development, a lot of planning, a lot of building equity within organizations. And then I sort of say that we have this like fourth category that is sort of like likely to fail, but we're going to try anyway because we're going to learn something. So this like nebulous fourth area of work. I also am really honored to sit on the Global Council for the Community-Centric Fundraising Movement and just started a term as board president for our AFP chapter here in St. Louis. And I'm very excited to be the first person of color to hold that role here as we go into our 50th anniversary year.
Wow, that's a lot of hats. And
Lots
I know those aren't even all the
I'm
hats.
not even going to talk about like my mom hat, my like Peloton hat, my like person that plans the parties hats, you know, the big sister hat. There's many.
Yes. But I'm so grateful for the work you do in our space and the way that you show up in our space. And I've been thinking a lot about, we hear the term community thrown around a lot, not just in terms of community-centric fundraising, but just building community in general. And it's mixed with a lot of other buzzwords like belonging and connection. And we sort of treat these terms as if they mean the same thing to everybody in all contexts and through all lenses. And I think more and more we're seeing evidence of how not true that is. And so I'm curious for you, like when you think about what it means to be sort of in connection, in community, what is your lens around that relationship?
Yeah. Thanks for the easy softball question to get us started today.
I just go right in. I'm so sorry. I just go right there.
No, I love it. I think in the last, 5 or so years, just living in a lot of turmoil and upheaval, and obviously pandemic life in this country, like the term and the word community and what we understand it to mean has shifted and changed countless times. And I'm sure it's going to continue to change, right? I think for some duration of time, it was easy for people to think about community as those who were proximate to them, right? We were living with, going to school with, working with. And over the course of the last few years, we've heard things like the shift from self-care to community care start to show up in our vocabulary. So who are the people that we trust to care for us, the people that we trust to respect our boundaries? We also see community start to come up with the things that we are interested in, right? So you even have these virtual spaces that are people that love to cook and share recipes or, running group or working moms, right? So we have these similar pieces of our identity, though we might not even be proximate to these people, right? They could be all over the place. What I have started to hear less about, right, is that people in our community tend to look like us and they share our same values and maybe we have the same experiences, but less and less do I find that community means sharing space with people who look differently or think differently or have different experiences. And I actually think that as we throw this word community around, we forget the benefits that we can experience from being in a relationship with people that are different from us in a lot of ways.
Ooh, okay. I knew if I went there with you, you were going to go there with me. And I think what you're talking about here is so interesting and so important, especially maybe as it relates to that question, the relationship between how we feel connected or connection and belonging and community. Because my guess would be that connection maybe feels more vulnerable when we're in community spaces with folks who don't have the same lived experience as us, look different than us, have different opinions than us. And so, what does it look like then to build connection and community? Like, what is necessary to build those
Yeah.
spaces in ways that are safe and account for inclusion and belonging of everyone who arrives there?
Yeah. So, it makes me think of growing up here in St. Louis. My parents immigrated to the United States in the late 70s. My brothers and I were born in St. Louis. And from a very early age, I understood, looking around at my proximate community, that there were a lot of people who identified as white and middle class that were proximate to me, actually sort of lived on this sort of main street that if you turned left, you would eventually drive into sort of the whiter, wealthier parts of our community. And if you turned right, you would drive into the more disinvested, marginalized, people of color and immigrant part of our community. So I literally felt like I was in the middle, but I also didn't have a lot of other people that looked like me. So as a child, growing up sort of in the middle, literally sort of the other, what you wind up having to do is figure out what you have in common with people who might not look like you or sound like you or smell the way your food smells, right, in your home, or wear the same clothes, but that you might have common interests, you might have common passions, you might enjoy going to the same park, right? Like, how do we get past the things that in some ways arbitrarily separate us and get to what we have in common so that we can learn from each other, even when we feel like things, don't always align?
What do you think it is? I love hearing that about your story too. And I'm curious, like, what do you think it is that inhibits people? Like, you were very much, it's not, forced into a situation that sort of required you to build relationships in that way.
Yeah.
What do you think inhibits people from exposing themselves to communities or environments that would encourage that type of relationship building?
Yeah, I think it can go a couple different ways. I think we all like to be comfortable, and it is a choice that we make to experience being uncomfortable or experiencing discomfort. And I think most people, when you think about everything, all, that we're juggling in the world, are generally going to pick the path of least resistance. I think it's just sort of who we are as humanity, right? And so we do tend to be attracted to things that feel safe and are like us. And in some ways, I think that keeps us really safe. And I use safe in a positive way, right? I also think that we want our experiences to be seen, that we want to be seen as humans, that we want to be valued for our experience. We want to be valued for the things that we share. And when you're navigating situations with people who might not be like you, it may be harder to show up vulnerably. I think, sort of, on the other side of it, there's a lot of privilege tied up in who we consider community, or who doesn't get to be part of our community, or who doesn't have a seat at our table. So, there's sort of this other part of it of also opting not to be a part of specific communities or tables that, makes it harder for us, I think, as proximate communities or communities of thinkers or communities who are sharing values, to learn and grow with each other. And so, you sort of bring up this concept of belonging. And for me, it's like, what does that mean? And how much do I need to feel that versus when is it healthy for me, a person that is both marginalized and has privilege, to experience what it feels like to belong or to not belong? Like, I find that to be a really rich experience personally that helps me navigate communities better. And for some people, that's really terrifying to think like I could be vulnerable and I might not belong, or I might be vulnerable and people are telling me, like, actually, no, you don't belong in this space. This is not for you.
Okay. I really appreciate the way you're talking about kind of how community forms across, like, in different ways, that it
Yeah.
used to be more sort of like proximate, and then
Yeah.
now, like, they're, value-based communities and
Hmm?
sometimes identity-based communities. And so I'm curious because I feel like when I hear people talk about or explore or think about exploring community-centric fundraising, that the
Yeah.
organizations that I see maybe lean more quickly into the idea that that could be a path forward are people who are organizations that exist in and fundraise from more proximate communities, that they sort of see the path forward around, like, how people have been excluded from their
Sure.
fundraising when they're, like, thinking about it in that sort of like geographical sense of
Yeah.
community. Where I see organizations maybe struggle to think about fundraising in more community-centric ways is communities that are built on values or identity, like fund donor communities that are being
Sure.
built on values and identity elements that then become exclusionary. And I feel like fundraisers have a harder time seeing what the path forward is
Yeah.
in creating community-centric, like, fundraising models in that
Yeah.
way. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So we'll back up just like two steps. So let's talk about community centric fundraising. I often like to remind people that when we talk about this concept, we are talking about a movement. We are talking about a set of ideas that challenge the way that our systems and institutions have worked, that really look at where they have failed our communities or where they have perhaps resulted in reduced harm, but not necessarily the systemic change needed, right? And what are the many ways in which we, as fundraisers, as nonprofit professionals, as advocates for our organizations, can create institutions and systems that better serve the communities that we seek to be in partnership with, that better steward the resources, right? And I name this specifically because I often hear on social media when I'm in conversation with folks this idea that sort of like donor centric fundraising and community centric fundraising are somehow like diametrically opposed to each other. And that's like false thinking. I really want to sort of dispel that, because when I think of donor centric fundraising, I think of a very specific kind of practice in a relationship between perhaps an organization, a fundraiser, and their donor, that ultimately sort of results in that donor giving more resources to said organization more frequently, which on its face sounds wonderful, right? But in practice has created a lot of power dynamics, a lot of privilege dynamics that wind up orienting an organization, its resources around keeping people happy, right? Keeping the donor giving, instead of being able to look at mission, listen to community, figure out what might need to change, and then bringing, right, those donors and that power and those resources along with us. So, wanted to make that distinction. When I think about the scenario that you describe with organizations that have kind of a harder time imagining what community centric fundraising look like, it often seems that these organizations are sort of stuck in that harm reduction place. They haven't been able to sort of get out of mission and really think about vision, and they really haven't been able to bring their donors along on a journey where donors are learning, or where donors are part of a conversation, or where an organization is saying, you know, we asked for X you gave us Y, which is, 40% less than our ask. And so we can't do Z. So if we can't do Z, right, what are we going to do instead, right? There's a lot of fear around this idea that we might say to our benefactors, we appreciate you and this isn't going to work. So can we talk about something that could be a little bit more transformative, right? Sometimes I think of myself as a recovering fundraiser. But when I think about this sector and when I think about my, early years fundraising with my first nonprofit organization, over my dead body, would I have told a donor that's a really great idea, but we're not going to do it because that's not what we do? I would have been like, yeah, oh my gosh, you're so inspired. Let me talk to my boss and figure out how we can make this work. And then I'm like, what? How are we going to do this? This is wild, right? But that's what I learned. And at the end of the day, I had this pressure that if I did not get those dollars in the door by that last day of the fiscal year, everything was going to come crumbling down. And how is that sustainable, either for a fundraiser or for organizations? So it is really my hope that as people become curious about community-centric fundraising, that they really think about it as transformation and sustainability for their organization. They think about adding seats to their table. They think about creating opportunities for people to learn, and that perhaps what we have done in the past worked for us then, but it might not work for us now. And if that's true, with all of the resources, right, I'm not a scarcity person. We got a lot in our corner, all right? How do we reimagine how we use those things to take our organizations and our donors on like a new and different journey together? And that really excites me about community-centric fundraising.
Yeah, there are a lot of things you said in there that I think really highlight this like connected way of being with each other, and that things become about so much more than the transaction of money moving from here to here in this sort of like one directional way, and then gratitude flows in one way. Or, I mean, of course, like so much of what you said, I felt the same way as an early fundraiser. I mean, the idea of saying, oh, no, that isn't exactly what I meant by that, or that isn't, actually how we're going to be able to achieve the goal that I see you wanting to achieve. That's actually not how we get there. And there's so many reasons for that. But I love that you just said, like, I'm not a scarcity person, because as you were talking about all of those things, I was like, what is required here, like, is breaking out of scarcity mindset. Because when you are in scarcity mindset, that's when you're going to take money at all costs. That's when you're not going to push back on a donor, because you're like, well, what if I lose it? What if then there won't be anybody else who wants to do anything with me? So how did you, like, sharing that in your earlier years, like you would have, never felt like you could sort of be there, to now saying, like, I'm not a scarcity person and I see the availability of opportunities when we are in this place and we're being honest about what's necessary and we bring people on this journey. How do you suggest people like start to move towards that inside themselves?
Yeah. So I think I would offer one starting point is that oftentimes people who are marginalized or have identities where they could be oppressed, they don't have a choice in the tactics of resilience, right? They don't have really a choice about how they show up in situations. And so when I think about, me as a child of immigrants growing up in this sort of very Catholic community that was like proximate to other people of color who also still didn't look like me, I didn't have a choice, right? It wasn't like I was not going to go to school or I was not going to be in a relationship. If I was going to thrive, I had to figure out who my people were. And that requires a lot of conversations. I think it requires a lot of listening to understand and a lot of asking questions to seek clarity, right? Because not everybody is going to be where you are sort of on this journey. And in sort of my earliest dreamings about what, anti-racism in fundraising could look like, or what systems change in fundraising could look like, the first goal, right, is to find the people who agree with you and also make friends with the people that don't, because you can't we can't do change without all of the people on the spectrum, right? So what relationships do we know? This is where I'm going to get what I need. This is like my abundance people. We're going to be like kicking around these big ideas. And who are the people that are going to push me, who are going to test my assumptions, who are maybe going to piss me off a little bit, but are going to keep me in conversation and keep me in check about the things that I'm trying to do and the things that I'm trying to advance. And so I think within any organization that's considering any kind of change, you have to be willing to have both your, like, the people who catch you when you fall and those critical friends at the table for change to happen successfully.
I love thinking about that, and I'm starting to categorize people in my mind,
Yeah.
who have been both of those
Yeah.
things for me. Okay, you said this piece before around like the donor journey and sort of what it looks like to bring people on that journey. And then you also
Yeah.
just said this part about people are at different places in their
Yeah.
own work. And so I'm thinking about, organizations that, and I'm glad that you talked about that piece around sort of donor-centric and community-centric and the conversation we usually hear there, but actually
Yeah.
what sort of like the root issues are there, because I'm thinking about a lot of organizations that have, used donor-centric practices that have then led them to this power dynamic that you were describing, that are interested or want to move away from those things and sort of
Yeah.
rewrite their relationships with
Mm-hmm.
their current donors and start to make their like fundraising more inclusive. And this piece around people being at different points in their
Yeah.
journey, but then also wanting to bring people along for the journey of the organization with the mission and community centered.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for how folks sort of think about that?
Yeah. So, one thing that I generally have noted during my time in the sector is that fundraisers and nonprofits sometimes are scared or anxious about being honest with their donors, telling them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We want to generally put our, best foot forward, even when that's maybe a fuzzy version of the truth, or not quite what is the term, not truthiness, there's like not quite truth there, right? And so I think for us, or I think for me, both when I was actively fundraising for organizations and in my work as a consultant, again, so we have these active listening conversations, we start to talk, because for me it's, why are donors even giving to this organization in the first place? What was it? What's your story? What's your experience that made this connection, right? And what have you come to expect from us? Because one thing that I find in sort of this journey towards community-centric fundraising is that an organization is excited about the values, they're excited about what a shift in organizing money and resources can mean. And then they change the rules without telling their donor, right, that things are shifting. And so I can't imagine, right, any other relationship that you have in your life where you wouldn't say to your partner, to a friend, to a family member, hey, we've been like this for a while and it's not really working for me. So I think it's time to try something new, right? Oftentimes in nonprofits, we want to like roll out the plan without building trust and buy-in with people, right? And then I'll have people say, well, isn't that perpetuating donor centrism? In some ways, yeah. But also, when you are in relationship with someone that is authentic, you bring them along. So, we'll start to have conversations with institutional funders to say, hey, I understand that you've organized your internal practices these ways so that you can report this information to your board of trustees. And you funded this many, people of color centered organizations or this many disability justice organizations. I get that. And also, let me tell you what that feels like over here, because we're out in the field, or my Edie's literally planting vegetables on the farm, 9 months out of the year, and isn't going to be that person that is filling out your weird, grant portal questions. So how do we ask the questions? What does it look like to make this process easier, more transformational? And what steps are we willing to take, right? Similarly, when we look at a lot of the headlines right now, you'll see all this, trust in nonprofits is dropping, donor giving is dropping, and those aren't things that are necessarily attributed to inflation or attributed to the economy or whatever, political anxieties or world anxieties we're feeling. But people, our donors, have also been sold a story for a long time, and we haven't fixed the problem, right? So we have been in sort of dishonest and inauthentic relationship with our donors. And these are brilliant human beings who chose to share their resources with us. And now we've given them a reason not to trust, right? So what does it look like to say, hey, I know this is what our relationship has looked like for the last 5 years. And here's what our organization has been through. And now I want to open the door to having a different conversation with you. And when we've had clients to do that, when we've had development folks in conversation with their donors, we've had donors say, oh my God, thank you. This has been bothering me because X. Or I've wanted to be so much more engaged in your organization, but you don't offer childcare. So all I can do is write a check because I can't be present when you all need to orient people, right? And so you open up this different level of dialogue that we really shut our money to donors out of, right? Like, we have expected a check, you write the check, we get the check, we thank you, we send your acknowledgement, right? Repeat. And so we have created the self-fulfilling prophecy, right, that we find ourselves in. And when we crack the door open for something different, you will get people that will say, yeah, I've been ready. You'll get people that will say, I'm curious, but I didn't know what that looked like. And you will have donors that will say, yeah, I'm not interested in that. This is not the conversation I want to have with you. And all of those things are okay, right? Because it's what's true. It's what's happening between our organization and the donor. We have a decision to make about where we invest our time, our resources, our energy to make sure that whatever resources we're organizing actually get our communities what they need, whether those are communities of people or animals or collectives or whatever it is, right? Like, we can't continue to be focused on making one group of people happy at the expense of mission and vision.
Okay, I so appreciate that breakdown. And I think I really there's so much gold in what you just said, but I think that piece around like the intersection of the fear of being donor centric, but also the need to take care of real relationships, and just like understanding that change happens intentionally. And because I think sometimes what I see is like a bunch of guilt around how people
Oh,
have
yeah.
historically fundraised, right? They hear things like this, they like experience all that guilt, and then they're like, okay, here's our brand new fundraising plan. And exactly what you said, they change all the rules with no
Yep.
conversation because the conversations feel uncomfortable and scary, and maybe means they have to face some of the things they're feeling really guilty about. But I think
Right.
like your point is so important. Like, relationships are relationship. And if you ultimately want to move towards fundraising in a different way, building community in a different way, like the slash and burn kind of
Yeah,
model
it doesn't
isn't going to
work.
work. Yeah.
No. And so this is why, I want to say again, like, when I think of community-centric fundraising as the sort of movement, there is a space for the practices of donor-centric fundraising to live in there, in my opinion. Does that mean that we continue to privilege our donors or continue to allow for a power imbalance? It doesn't. And that's not a part of the original definition, right? Donor-centric fundraising wasn't supposed to be we give our donors power, right? It was supposed to be we're in good relationship and we get resources because they understand, right? So we can take the best pieces of that, right? And it advance our organizations to have a more holistic and justice-oriented view of what change looks like, of what impact looks like, right? So we're not going to continue for the next 20, 30, 40, 100 years to ask for the same things and maybe do slightly less, but that we can really get intentional and strategic and leverage the enthusiasm of donors and the experience of our communities and the willingness and interest of our neighbors, right? That's so much richer than thank you for your $100 check. We'll make sure you get that gala invite and we'll send you that tax letter and we'll see you, right? That's not what people are seeking anymore. The tax laws have changed, right? The world is changing. We have to be willing to let go of the things that maybe felt like they worked in the past and get a little uncomfortable as fundraisers. But I'll tell you, when I have done that, what I have learned in those conversations winds up far outweighing any fear that I felt going into them.
Okay, I want to leave folks with that right there, although I know we could talk for so much longer. But will you tell everyone where they can find you, follow along, work with you, all of the things?
Yeah. So you can come find me at our website. So www.gladiatorrds.com. I am also on LinkedIn. Come find me there, Rachel D'Souza. And I love Instagram. So look up, _ Rachel.D'Souza on Instagram and come hang out with me. Sort of a guilty pleasure. So happy to connect in any or all of those spaces.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing all of your wisdom with us today and for everything you do for our space.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so excited that actually, y'all should know the reason that Mallory and I met is because my daughter hit her with a ping pong ball when she was like 8.5 months pregnant. And this poor pregnant woman turns around and gets up to bring this ping pong ball over. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what is happening? So who knew that the errant ping pong ball would lead to such a beautiful and serendipitous connection? I'm so happy we got to talk
grateful. I'm so grateful for all of it. And I would have found you, even if it wasn't for the ping pong ball, but that is a better introduction. So I love it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.